You want to come up here? Okay, go lay down then. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sarah and this is Sassy Life Story. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about this book, Goodbye Things by Fumio Sasaki, about what he calls the new Japanese minimalism. If you have been to my channel recently, I am currently doing a low buy for the year for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I do have a large savings goal that I set for myself. And secondly, I do want to reduce the number of items I have, mainly makeup, skincare, and clothing, which are all things that I bought a lot of in the last year while I was not able to do a lot of the normal things I would do, and I just have too much. So one of the things I love to do is read, and I am looking at reading books so I can just stay on track with these goals, learn more about myself, and kind of think about where I can improve or work on things. One of the things that I think is lacking in a book like The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo is the idea that not everything has to spark joy. And I do think she talks about this where there are things that we need, so they spark joy by fulfilling that need for us when we have the need to use them, but I do think that sometimes people kind of overlook that. So what I liked about this book was that he went back to the idea that our possessions are tools to be used, and that could be a tool that is used to spark joy, or it could be a tool that's used literally as a tool to accomplish something for us in our lives. So he does have, I believe, 5 chapters in his book, and they all kind of do something different. So first up, he does define what minimalism means to him. What he says is that minimalism is to reduce our necessary items to a minimum and do away with excess so we can focus on what is important to us. So in that regard, he thinks of minimalism as individual for each person, so you reduce to your necessary items and get rid of the excess so you can focus on what is important to you. So I think that that's really important to think of as well, that not everybody is going to have the same appearance for minimalism, but they could all fit this definition. Then he goes into why we accumulate, which I think is always useful to think about or consider for yourself, and a lot of that is, potentially what have you learned growing up, or just how your brain works. Then he goes through basic techniques to reduce, and he has a lot of different tips that he goes through, so I think that's always useful. Having somewhere to start always makes it easier. And then he goes into things about what the changes did for him and how they were positive for him. And then his next chapter is why those changes made him happy. I think something that he talks about where he discusses minimalism not as a goal, but as a method to go down like a certain path is really useful too, because a lot of people will think of minimalism as like, oh, I need to have 30 clothing items only, and that's my goal. And then you kind of get stuck when you're trying to move to that goal, but it's not what really is minimalism for you. You get kind of stuck in that, and then you're like, oh, well, I guess I'm not a minimalist, or I failed. So removing that idea from your mind, I think, is useful. So one of the things that he talks about that I think really stuck with me is the idea of like the silent to-do list, or the time that we're spending on our possessions, even just thinking about them, like the mental effort that you have to put into having all of your items, whether that's actually thinking about your item's existence or thinking about cleaning it, thinking about where something is when you need it. So he actually discusses like thinking about stores as places where you are storing things and you can just go and get something if you need it instead of keeping it in your house. And along that same line, he talks about thinking about what you're gaining when you declutter items versus what you're losing. So instead of thinking about like, oh, I love this shirt, I don't want to lose it, which if you love something, maybe you don't need to declutter it. But if you're just attached to all of your things, not thinking about what you're losing, but what you're gaining. So is that more space in your house, less time thinking about those things, less time taking care of that shirt, more freedom, more energy, like you're not constantly cleaning, so you are able to have more energy to do other things you like to do. And one of the things he discusses is the idea of decluttering it might not be something you do very frequently, so you might not be familiar with that. So it may be difficult just because you don't do it often. So actually starting and working on decluttering can be like your first step. And minimizing things might require effort, so it can always be useful to think about minimizing the effort that is needed to declutter. You know, what can you do to do that? Can you just be focused on keeping your empty space empty, not refilling it with things? The idea that things will tend to bring in more things. So if you get down to a lower number, you might kind of change your habits and not go out and buy a book that you don't want to store, because if you buy that one book, then you might kind of buy something else at the bookstore, right? Like maybe you also see a cute bag while you're there and then you buy it. And you see a journal and you buy it. And these things are things that you didn't need, but you saw them while you were out at the store. So just the idea that you're buying one thing can make other things pile on. He does also bring up the idea that although obtaining things can kind of give you some joy in that act of obtaining something, so can getting rid of something. So it can be useful to not get too dependent on obtaining new items to bring you, interest in your life. You can also do that by getting rid of things. And I think for me personally, like, getting rid of things can mean so many different things to different people. I would prefer not to just throw things away. So if you're able to even find somebody else who's actually going to use the thing you no longer need, that can actually bring you joy all on its own, that your possession that wasn't useful for you can be for somebody else. One of the things I found really useful too when you're thinking about decluttering is the idea to start from actual trash. So do you have any like actual junk or trash that you're holding on to that you don't need? Do you have empty cardboard boxes from things you've bought that maybe you don't even have anymore? Like that iPhone you bought 6 years ago that you no longer own and you still have the box for some reason. Like, just start with those really simple things that you don't have any use for really, and getting rid of those first. And then that builds some momentum up so you can get rid of more things. So one of the parts I did think is really useful if you're looking at this book is this section that's 55 tips to help you say goodbye to your things. And it actually is just a bunch of tips and little descriptions for his tips to help you get rid of things. So let's just pick one randomly. Okay, so number 16, our things are like roommates except we pay their rent. So with this one, he talks about how in Japan, it said that you need half a tatami mat for someone to be seated and a full one for them to sleep. That's actually all the space we need to get by. So this is a quote from the book. And then if you add a roommate, then you would add space for another mat. So you wouldn't increase your rent very much because you don't have to increase your space very much. But you think about your items as roommates and they don't pay anything for your rent, and they actually create extra work for you. And so you have to think about, do you want to continue to pay the rent to store these items of yours, or do you want to kick them out? And this can also be something to think about, like, do you need as much space as you have, or could you actually downgrade if you downgraded your items and then save money because you're spending less on your space? So that's one tip. Here's another one I think is really good. So this is 34. If you lost it, would you buy it again? So basically, if something happened to your item, would you buy it again at full price? If the answer is yes, you probably do actually have it as a necessary item and you should keep it. But if you aren't interested in buying it again, maybe you're just keeping it because it's good enough, in quotes. So, if it's just good enough, maybe you should get rid of it. And if you do actually need something in that category, look into getting something new in that category that you would repurchase if you were to somehow lose it. And if 55 things isn't enough for you, he also goes into 15 more tips for the next stage of your journey. So if you need to minimalize even more or think about even more ideas, I'll read the last one because I actually wrote down a note about this one. He says minimalism is a method and a beginning. So again, it's not just to reduce, but to eliminate the distractions so you can focus on what's truly important to you. And that is going to look different from what's truly important to me. So our minimalism might not look the same. Overall, I really enjoyed reading this book. I think it brought kind of a different perspective to minimalism. I think it's really useful to not get caught up in one specific idea of what minimalism looks like and try to adhere to that, because it probably won't work for you. Just doing what somebody else has done is not necessarily the best way to do things, since we are all so different. I do think, you know, he's got some pictures at the beginning of his own minimalism kind of outcome and some other people's that, you know, is probably not what my minimalism is ever going to look like, but they are kind of nice to look at and think about as an idea. But going back to what he's saying about it not being just one specific thing that minimalism looks like, your minimalism doesn't have to look like this person in a room on the floor with a mat and a stool or small table. Your minimalism might look very different. Your minimalism could be 20 times as much stuff as Fumio Sasaki owns. I think he said he has something like 150 items or 200 items. You might have a lot more than that, but if it's still minimalism for you because it clears your mind and your space of clutter and unnecessary things, then you're still being a minimalist in the way that he is. So I think this is useful information. I enjoyed reading this book, and if you're interested, I would recommend it. I'll go ahead and put a link down in the description box if you want to look into this book. And thank you so much for watching. You can check out my low-buy introduction video if you want to. You can subscribe for more videos like this. I will be reviewing other books throughout this time that are similar, and you can always just hit that like button to help me out. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.